seem to be in working order. So again, I want you to hopefully see some of the structure of the lecture, some of the structure of what you need to understand about federalism. We're looking at the expansion of federal power through a variety of mechanisms. The one that you just wrapped up with is looking at key clauses, key court cases that interpreted those clauses and allowed expanded power. So you were looking at the 14th Amendment. There's a whole variety of cases that you could look at, but Brown v. Board is kind of the classic example. With that, we transferred or transitioned over to looking at executive and legislative action. And what happens is there's a type of federalism that is created based on opportunity and actions by the government. The first kind we looked at was dual or layer cake. Bless you. And what you see is separate and autonomous levels of government that essentially you don't see the federal government asserting authority over the states. What you see in your exemplars, and we'll look at this tomorrow during your warm-ups, is a variety of places where there's opportunity. There's opportunity to say, we're going to grant citizenship to slaves, we're going to give them a standing in the court, and we're going to uphold the Missouri Compromise, but they don't, right? There's opportunity here to rule against segregation, policies that allow for segregation, but they don't. And then there's, opportunity to regulate the economy. There's growing industry. We're in increasingly, there's an interdependent kind of economy. There's some big forces out there like the railroads, and the federal government, again, has an opportunity to regulate, but they don't. Teddy Roosevelt often is held up as, the trust buster, and he manages the economy. What I try to point out is it's a little more selective. He gets involved when he feels there's a major imbalance. Otherwise, he allows the economy to run on its own. The other one we looked at was cooperative, or marble cake. And what, again, the analogy is trying to get you to see is that there is the federal and the state level are no longer separate and autonomous. They're inexorably intertwined, working on common problems. They agree on the problems, and they agree, by and large, about the solutions. The federal government may be directing it and the funds, but they're working cooperatively to get us out of the Depression and to meet wartime needs. Again, the cornerstone, when you think of these types of federalism, these eras, you often want to associate it with the president. In this case, it's FDR, and often that president has, a name for their domestic policy. In this case, the New Deal. And remember, there's the 3 R's in there when you define it. The idea of both relief, which is immediate, the recovery, which is getting us back on our feet, and then the reform, which is long-term. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. I don't think you have to remember every policy, but what you do want to get down is the economics behind it. And we did this somewhat in a rush on Friday. There's demand side and there's supply side, and these are two different sides of the equation. These represent two different levers that we might, work in the middle of a recession or a depression. Okay, so what we've got is unemployment. With unemployment, we've got a decline in production. With a decline in production, where businesses aren't growing, they're certainly not going to be solving that unemployment problem. You've got a kind of related issues of problem with falling real estate prices, a fall in the GDP. We're in a spiral. So how do you get us out? Well, what John Maynard Keynes suggests, it's named Keynesian economics or demand-side economics, is to prime the pump by having the government supplement the lack of private spending. That gives businesses the capital they need to kind of grow and expand and do hiring. And it's okay if you're doing it at a deficit. The deficit is less of an ill than the spiraling economy. So even if the government has to go into kind of deficit spending, eventually what you'll do is get businesses, you get spending going again, which gets businesses going again, which gets hiring going again, which allows our constant cycle of consumption to kind of kick back in and keep our economy going. When we get to it later with new federalism, you're going to see the kind of alternative to that happens under Reagan. It's called supply side economics. It's called Reaganomics, and derisively, it's called trickle down economics. And the idea here is to help the supply side, to cut down on costly regulations, to adjust tax structures so that it doesn't cost as much to do business, and to basically create a bunch of business-friendly reforms so that businesses can run cheaper, and therefore they can hire, and as they hire, people have more money to consume, and there's our constant cycle of consumption again. I say derisively because there's a leap of faith, I guess, on both ends. There's a leap of faith that if you put more money in people's pockets, when the government is, at its point where it is taking in the least and spending the most on entitlement programs, that people will consume, and that it will invariably kick things in. On the other end, the reason it's called trickle down is because you are giving business-friendly kind of, there's business-friendly policy, but often it also includes, we look at wages differently than we look at investment money. So there often is a tax structure for the top 1%, where we're not going to tax their money the same. They're often going to have more of their money in investments, and we're not going to tax investments the same way as we do as wages. And that combined with the business-friendly tax breaks leads to a concern that basically what we're doing is we're giving all this wealth to the top 1 to 5% in the hope that they will invest, in the hope that they will take that money and use it to make more money and get our economy going again. And so for many, it's the idea of, I've often seen images. I don't know if you ever, if you've been to that kind of classic wedding where there's all these wine glasses stacked up, and you begin to pour into this large goblet at the top, and as it overflows, it fills the other glasses. That's kind of the analogy of trickle down. You give to the industry giants, the ones that can kind of make the jobs, and eventually it gets down to the rest of us. You're going to see later on some political cartoons that satirize that suggest all that really happens is the goblet up at the top gets bigger, and eventually we might get the crumbs. Okay, so it's there are two sides to the equation. I think it's continue my analogy, a fairly fluid argument. I think that there's arguments both for some demand side and supply side, and being a moderate, I suppose I tend to kind of look for something in the middle. That whenever you go to either of the two extremes in terms of policy, there's perhaps an imbalance. We'll get to this more in our economic policy as well. Inflation is a different beast. It's different than a recession. Again, in a recession and in a depression, you've got unemployment, and that largely begins to kill the consumption cycle. And then you've got all these other symptomatic problems. Inflation is simply where your dollar is buying you less. And what we try to use there is not fiscal policy. This is how we spend and take in money. We try to use monetary policy. We try to do things to increase or decrease the money supply to therefore increase or decrease its value. So if I've got inflation, what I want to do is maybe create a scarcity of money. I'm going to have lower interest rates. I'm going to change the amount I charge banks for borrowing money. I'm going to have higher taxes. And that way I'm taking in more money. You've got less money in your pocket. If I can create a scarcity of money where you're reluctant to part with it, then the value of money starts to go up relative to goods. So that's one of the tactics. Again, during the Reagan years, you'll see them use this. Another idea though is to maybe I can combat it by going through the looking glass, by creating more money and just getting you willing to spend a little bit more relative to those goods. And Again, that's a leap of faith. All right. So, again, I don't think you need to know all of these. I think you need to know the economic policy. I think you would need to be able to show me one or two or three that indicate, okay, we're doing supply side economics here. We're basically the public sector is trying to make up for a lack of private sector spending. And here's an example. Okay, the wartime efforts are distinguished from the other ones just trying to deal with the Depression. One thing to note with Roosevelt, and hopefully you covered this in your history classes, is that 100 days where you had that flurry of legislation that led to all these bureaucratic programs with all of the acronyms, all the letters to be called alphabet soup, an alphabetocracy. That was challenged by the Supreme Court. He had a conservative Supreme Court, and we talked about the New Deal cases where they initially deal with any effort to use taxing and spending as a carrot and stick, and they strike it down. They determine a lot of these programs are coercive, and eventually they pivot to saying no, it induces. And to be honest with you, I don't think there's a big difference in the policies. I think there's a big difference in the court, and it all comes from FDR's court packing scheme. So what did he threaten to do? What did he threaten to do to get the court to begin to soften?
Like when judges turn 70, he'd put more judges.
He was going to put more judges in, and he was going to use retirements and age as one way. But does the Constitution prohibit him from? How many justices are there supposed to be according to the Constitution? Trick question, right, Guy? Why is it a trick question? Doesn't say, right? So he can use that as an opportunity as well to kind of create new seats and eventually get the balance he wants. The court, I think, recognizing the danger to the institution of hacking it to get the rulings that they want. They're not immune from political pressures. They're somewhat insulated, but they're not entirely immune. And that threat was enough to get them to pivot. What you look at when you look at FDR is he is somewhat kind of dividing. For many people, and I'll show you a quote in a second, they hold him up as a savior. I mean, the nation was in absolute crisis. From perhaps Civil War, is maybe number one. But you can debate whether the Great Depression combined with World War II was equal, if not greater than that threat. And he successfully navigates us through it. And therefore, he gets a ton of credit. The credit he gets is for building this modern welfare state. And sometimes the term seems a little generic, but what I hope you see in it is the idea that government is radically changed after FDR. The scope of what it is responsible for is, grown exponentially. It's exploded in terms of what it's responsible for under FDR. I mean, that flurry of alphabet soup programs is an indication of that. So we had a more limited view of what government is responsible for. And as we enter to the modern age, we have the modern welfare state, where we begin to consider the federal government responsible for all aspects of your well-being. So hold on to that phrase. And again, this is why he's both loved and perhaps reviled, because it depends on whether or not you see the federal government as a necessary safety net, or if you see it as the government that governs the least governs the best. And I would prefer solutions elsewhere. I have this quote and this image that you studied his fireside chats where he would, address the nation, and a lot of economics and a lot of politics, for that matter, is psychology. There's anxiety surrounding this current election cycle, and it gets fairly contagious, and it causes trust in our governmental institutions to erode, whether it's elections or, faith in the media. The economy is the same thing. The president says things are going to be okay, and that increases consumer confidence, and that is all the fix you need sometimes for the economy. We'll talk about the head of the Fed. Her name is Janet Yellen. If she so much as hiccups and hints that maybe we've got to adjust interest rates, the stock market goes crazy. It runs on psychology. So, him coming on and talking to people through these fireside chats where they kind of he sat around his home and hearth, and you sat around your home and hearth, and this is a Philco radio that, It's amazing the size of it, right? When they wanted to kind of break dance, that was kind of hard to carry out to the street with your. Anybody still break dance to a Philco radio? So the part I like about the quote is how he talks about how you had to be there. If you want to understand FDR, you had to be in the middle of the Great Depression. You had to understand the desperation that people were facing. And, FDR gets mythologized, but 60 years ago, the myth looked like hope. In his fireside chats, he turned our Philco radios into shrines. I love that image. And when he said that America could not afford to live with 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-fed, we thought he would do something about it, and he did. So there's the psychology of it, that we mythologize FDR to the people that saw him as a beacon of hope, that myth is real. For other people, like I said, they demonize him, perhaps for creating that modern welfare state that they rail against. And that leads us to creative federalism, which is going to be under LBJ, which is an expansion of what FDR did. We're going to have even more of a modern welfare state. So what you see here is, what defines it, what delineates it. Before I had this inexorable mix of federal and state working together cooperatively. They agreed on the problem. They agreed on the approach. Well, here, I picked kind of a funfetti cupcake here. I've got different colors in here, right? So what you see is expanded partnerships. It's not just states, it's cities, it's counties, it's school districts, it's nonprofit agencies. We'll talk, for example, about Head Start. Head Start are private corporations that come into communities to run preschool for low-income kids, and they work off of federal grants, okay? So I'm going to reach out to anybody, any kind of entity that I think can get the job done. The other difference is, before I said that simple mix of federal and state was cooperative. Here, you see a lot more federal mandates. I won't go so far as to say coercive, but you do see the federal government using more of the power of grants and aid as a carrot and stick. You see more of the inducing. And, my wife is a trained pastry chef, so before she's kind of more on the business side, but I ran out of cake analogies here, and so I had to use her cake expertise to help me, like what's this kind of cake and what's this? So later on when I come up with other cakes, it was through deep discussions with my wife trying to figure out what analogy to use there. And I said, how do I get this to be kind of coercive? And she said, well, who doesn't want a cupcake, right? So use that. I've got a funfetti cupcake with more kind of levels involved here, and who doesn't want a cupcake? You kind of have to take it, don't you? It's right. It's kind of, it's the right size and it looks delicious. Who doesn't want a cupcake? All right. So with FDR, we had the New Deal. With LBJ, we have the Great Society. And again, there's a trio. Instead of relief, recovery, and reform, what I've got is a set of domestic policies, a whole flurry of them again. And what we're trying to do is take on three major issues. So you, again, really hold on to them. Poverty, racial injustices, and you got to be careful. You can't say urbanization. Living in cities is not a problem. What happens is there are some ills associated with urbanization, especially if we're talking, there's twofold here. There is ethnic enclaves where you've got minority populations that are facing discrimination, that live in low socioeconomics. I'm going to fight the racial injustice that's there, and I want to fight the poverty that's there. He also, tries to come up with some policies against urban blight. Often economics means we don't pay attention to the, I don't want to minimize it, but aesthetics of things. That there are little things that make, you look at how we're developing here in Georgetown, and there are shops and things like that, but they try to include a little patch of grass here and there and some trees here and there, and not have the stores right up against the roadway to create kind of claustrophobia. There's not a ton of signage that creates this kind of urban blight. So he's going to kind of fight all of that. Poverty, racial injustice, urbanization. FDR opened up the vault, essentially, and showed us that government can solve a lot of ills, and he wants to create this ideal society. When we look at the efforts to combat racial injustices, I mean, these are major, major cornerstone pieces of legislation at a time where there's a lot of racial unrest. It is amazing the deal maker that LBJ was, how he was able to get a lot of these done. And sometimes they blur together. So Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a cornerstone piece of legislation. You really should be familiar with it. There's two aspects to it. One, it is working to outlaw segregation in public accommodations. That's where the government has the most leverage. Public accommodations, things that they help fund, right? Things that, whether it's on the state or local level, are funded at taxpayers' expense, as opposed to private institutions. They'll work on that one a little differently. What they're looking, also to do is to end discrimination in employment, in education, and in voting. To get to the voting, we've got to take it a step further. So you combine the Civil Rights Act with the Voting Rights Act that looks to take away all of those discriminatory policies that act as a barrier to voting, whether it's a literacy test, a poll tax, the things that you guys kind of studied before you came in. The other thing that they're looking for, and it's interesting again, because here it is in our current election, is this idea of, okay, I've eliminated a lot of the tests, but would there be voter intimidation? Would there be some sort of presence at the polls that intimidates people from voting, from coming to the polls and voting as they wish? And so what we see is, this idea of voter fraud, which there's like 140 million, I think that's roughly the number of people that vote in a given election cycle. In a 12-year period, according to, again, you can take studies as you want, in a 12-year period, there were 38 cases of voter fraud. So that's going to tip the electoral results, right? And all 38 would face a felony charge. That's pretty major. Of the 38, 10 were prosecuted and 4 got convictions. Okay? There's an idea of voter fraud that most Americans, is there voter fraud? Sure. I'm registered in 2 places. I am. And that has more to do with the fact that I moved and I didn't, basically I re-registered to vote, but I didn't unregister to vote at the old place. So arguably, could I show up in 2 places? I suppose. Would I then face a felony charge? Yes. And that's to tip the vote 1 vote. I'd have to show ID and I'd have to show current kind of, so I'd have to create a false document too to do this. And I would face a felony charge to kind of swing Massachusetts 1 vote in a predominantly Democratic state. So I think I'm going to go for that. That sounds smart. Long story short, there is this idea of voter fraud. And is there? Yes, but is it mostly anecdotal? You got to be carefully anecdotal. Have there been occasions? Sure. Are there there's 1.8 million dead people registered. Are they voting? No, they're dead. No one has said, let's go through the bureaucratic paperwork of getting these people off the rolls. Do people get bused to vote? Yeah, elderly, they'll go over to Trestle Way, and there'll be different groups that try to help get them to the polls. In areas where people don't have rides, transportation will be provided. Are there some operatives on both ends of the spectrum that might do some shady things? Sure. Not as bad as LBJ when they were actually packing the ballot box, or Rutherford v. Hayes, where they kind of stole elections. Right? We've got an FEC, a Federal Elections Commission, an FEC. We've got an FBI. These things are reported and investigated. Are probably this is where being antiquated is actually an advantage. We don't vote via the internet. So, Russia can hack us a lot in different places, including voter registration. That's where you see maybe a lot of fraud in terms of people kind of being purged from the ballot. But that's political. There's other factors at play there. Russia's not going to hack our electoral results. And if they did, you would see that they're wildly different than the polls. And there would be some smoke that would be investigated. Is gerrymandering and kind of taking away voting power as much of voter fraud as anything else? Both sides kind of do it. They just do it by different means, I suppose. Long story short, the reason I'm bringing this up is this, there's a talk during the campaign of going down to those areas and making sure that the vote isn't stolen from us. Well, what does it look like if a bunch of people are crowded around the polls with intimidating signs and you know, what else might they do to intimidate? There's reasons why we had poll watchers. If that's still a kind of concern today, can you imagine what it looked like in the 60s, right? So there would be poll watchers as part of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, where you made sure in areas where there was a percentage of African Americans that were, let's say they make up 60% of the population, yet they only make up 20% of the voting population. Okay, something's wrong there. They're not registered in equivalent numbers. What do we need to do? Now, the other thing I want to focus on, Civil Rights Act expands it again. We're looking at housing discrimination here. The other thing I want to look at is the war on poverty. This is incredibly ambitious. We've got over 60 programs that are going after the ills of poverty, whether it's hunger, whether it's health, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the urban blight I talked about. LBJ declares, I picked this because, one, it reminds you what he looks like. Two, it gives you percentage. 22% were living below the poverty line. Where are we today? It's roughly the same. So we'll see a lot of effort, and what you have to kind of consider is, was this a success, or are we right where we started from? And if we're right where we started from, what was the problem? Is it, did we not go far enough? Did we, with changes in government, change our policy and kind of regress? Or could it have been worse? That's another way of looking at it. Was it good that we did all of this because, at least that kept it at 20%, and it could be worse? So, we're going to look at this a little critically. But when you look at the war on poverty, you can kind of group it. And again, I don't think you need to hold on to everything. I just think you need some exemplars to show me that this is creative federalism, that I'm reaching out to more than just states, and that I've got some mandates tied to this. This is a little more, again, I shy away from coercive, but there's things that hold states in the local levels more accountable. I'm going to induce, or I might coerce, depending on how you want to look at it, I suppose. Head Start I already mentioned. That's a great example because you go to a non-governmental agency, private corporations, and you contract with them to provide preschool. It's amazing. Again, you guys, who had preschool? How many of you went to preschool? So that's, all of you, right? That's privately funded. That comes out of parents' pockets. If you don't have the income to go to preschool, what do? Right? And do you come to school at a disadvantage? Increasingly, what you're finding is the curriculum that you used to teach in the second grade has gone to the first grade, and the first grade has gone to kindergarten, and kindergarten's gone to preschool, and kids are coming to school with an ability to read, an ability to kind of, manipulate numbers. This is considered foundational stuff, and if you don't have that, you're at a disadvantage. And is the question, the question is, would you ever catch up? I'm going to get my numbers wrong. Kids from a high income, a medium to high income family come to school with like a working vocabulary of 30,000 words. And then kids from a low income area will come to school with a working vocabulary of about a fifth of that, around 6,000 words. It's you look at the number of books that you would have in your house, which would be around 200, and then you look at the number of books that they would have in a low income house, and it's like 0 to 5. I'll pull those numbers up again. I'm really close in terms of my range. Head Start was this idea of you're never going to compete fairly, and this cycle of disadvantage will repeat unless we catch people up. And we're going to do it creatively. We're going to reach out to private sector and just use governmental funds to fund whoever runs the best program. The Elementary and Secondary Act is something that every president updates. It essentially, they look at areas of national priority and then begin to implement mandates and carrot and stick for that. So, for example, No Child Left Behind, where they begin to look for schools to show they're making adequately yearly progress teaching national standards, is the national version of MCAS. They got that from us largely. They also focus here during the Great Society on Higher Education. Teacher Corps is kind of an interesting concept. I'm going to show you some things that still are in existence that, if you're, exploring things to find a way to meaningfully impact and contribute, that's, they're out there. There's other, I'll show you kind of like a domestic Peace Corps, and I'll show you kind of, well, Job Corps doesn't quite apply to you, but I'll show you sites where they, people are able to kind of, connect with volunteer work or real work, or Teacher Corps is kind of a specific type of volunteerism. They're out there, and it's a way to do good. It's also a way to diversify a resume in an increasingly competitive college environment, not to be too cynical. So do kind of pay attention to those. In terms of health and welfare, we talked about Medicare and Medicaid. You guys know that. The Child Nutrition Act had been there since Truman, and largely what it was doing was providing lunch and milk. And what the Child Nutrition Act did is expanded it. So in terms of who gets coverage for the lunch and milk program, that gets expanded. In terms of what's provided, is it a basic cheese sandwich, or is it something more? Do you have a better range of things that I'm offering? But what they also begin to offer is a school breakfast program as well. Can't imagine how you learn if you're coming to school on one meal a day or 2 meals a day. What that does to growing kids, right? We had a quiche in the house the other day. Egg pie, right? My son came down and he cut half of it. He put it on a plate. That's 11, right? You eat half of essentially a quiche and think that that's normal. So you can't imagine how you think with all of that. Things to kind of spotlight. Like I said, Job Corps is a really interesting thing. What we're looking at is almost back to the Hull House. It's a residential center, but it also provides job training, like the Hull House and the Adams House and things that you might have studied. What we're going to try to do too is provide connections to jobs. So we're going to give you job training. We're going to give you basic education, but I'll show you in a second. There's a website that still connects people, young people who might be from low-income areas who might not have education, with jobs. That's still there. VISTA is the domestic Peace Corps, essentially. You can go overseas and work on projects and do good work, but there are also opportunities to do it here domestically. Legal services is an interesting one to look at because, this, I think, forces us to wrestle with, how expansive are unalienable rights? At what point do economics begin to deny unalienable rights? So, we agree that you have speech and press and assembly. Do you have a right to, the same level of quality education? Is that an unalienable right, that everybody should be equally educated? Do you have a right to health insurance and the same quality of health insurance, or should money dictate what quality of education and employment dictate what quality of insurance or medical care that you get? How about legal services? So let's say you have a job and you are fired and you feel it's wrongful, that you've been wrongfully terminated. If you have a job and you have income, or had a job and had income and it was a higher income, maybe I could afford an attorney and I could bring a suit against the company and get reinstated or combat that somehow. But what if you're low income? Can't do it. What if I'm evicted from my house? Again, if I have income and I'm wealthy, I can afford an attorney and I can pursue my legal rights. But if you're low income, you can't, right? So there's more than just needing an attorney for being criminally accused. Let's say there's an accident and, the insurance company fines against me and I'm facing all kinds of penalties. I'm facing all kinds of costs. Maybe I want to fight that. But if I'm low income, I can't. I can't afford to. So there's more than just criminal cases. There's civil cases where simply the verdict is going to go against you because you can't afford an attorney. Should we provide one at public expense? That's what legal services does. LBJ is not done. LBJ is also, like I said, going to go after things like urban blight, and he's going to go after environmental concerns. We get the Water Quality and Clean Air Act under him. There's a Highway Safety Act. There's a Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. We've got new agencies. We've got a Highway Safety Board. We've got a HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is established. Just to kind of show you quickly, here is, again, to show you that, if you're looking for a more interesting, unique kind of type of volunteerism, your community service hours, here's AmeriCorps. And, essentially there's almost 1 million people that have contributed all this time, and scholarships are available through this. So, I'll put a link up to that, and you can check that out. This is, they kind of went bare bones on their webpage, didn't they? It tells you something here with the volunteerism versus here's how you get connected with Job Corps. But again, if you are, there's eligibility requirements, but they connect you with work training and with work. And there's just a link to legal aid, just to show you that these things are all still kind of out there and providing services for people. Okay, so I'm in good shape here because I'm wrapping up with creative federalism, and that sets us up for new federalism tomorrow. I want to do my kind of overall evaluation. What you see here is maybe, again, it's polarizing. Either you love that the federal government has taken on these problems, that it is a vehicle for change, or maybe you see, again, the idea of too big of a federal government taking on problems that are too big for it. So, what we see is a growth in bureaucracy under LBJ. And again, they specialize, but they create these procedures and protocols, I'll say that all year, procedures and protocols, that on some level control the process and suffocate the process. Bureaucracies are supposed to run efficiently, but often what they do is they drive up costs with their procedures and protocols. And what you see, and we're going to debate this with new federalism as well, is this idea of a modern welfare state has another side to the coin. Are we perpetuating people's need for support, or are we eventually creating a means for them to get off that support? Have we created not a modern welfare state, but a perpetual welfare state? Does that make sense? So we can debate that. Regardless of which one we're doing, there's expense that goes with it. And I showed you that poverty and racial inequality certainly do persist. You have to debate whether it would have been worse, whether or not poverty and racial inequality can persist because of a lack of consistent policies. We kind of go to different approaches. Is it more due to contemporary issues? Certainly progress was made. I will say that. Again, just as a kind of a last-minute reminder, what's different again is it's more creative in that we're reaching out to different levels of government and non-governmental organizations, and then there's the mandates. The mandates, again, are mostly carrot and stick. It's if you want this money, then you have to do these things. But remember, with every new agency that they create, there's a new group to monitor and to bring suits. So that's another way we enforce. And just to give you a quick visual, a lot of the attention to what seems to be a disproportionate use of force against African American citizens, and in particular unarmed African citizens, and in particular male unarmed African citizens, started in Ferguson, where there was a shooting of an unarmed black man. This is a report by the Department of Justice that went in all the newspapers, essentially. Do you think this is pretty damning, just looking at it? Would this cause Ferguson and other localities to look more at their police procedures and any racial implications? I mean, that's in the newspaper. That's the power of monitoring. You put a spotlight on it. Okay, good job.